I did not expect the warning to come from a man holding a rake. I had just stepped out of my car after a 4-hour drive, my back aching, my hands still stiff from gripping the wheel, and I was standing in front of the most beautiful property I had ever seen in my life, knowing that my son had built it and never once invited me to see it. The garden was immaculate. The dock stretched clean and straight over still blue water. And then a man I had never met in my life walked toward me with a look on his face that was not welcoming, not curious, and not polite. He grabbed my arm at the elbow, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to mean something, and he leaned in close and said, "Leave before he gets back." I did not leave. And what happened over the next 3 days changed everything I thought I understood about my son, about the woman he married, and about the years I had spent quietly carrying a family that never once looked back to check if I was still standing. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something real. If a stranger told you to leave your own child's property before your child came home, what would you do? Would you drive away quietly and pretend it never happened? Would you call your son right then and force a conversation neither of you was ready for? Or would you do what Lewis did, which was stay completely still, look that man directly in the eye, and decide that the days of leaving quietly were over? Think about your answer while this story unfolds, because Lewis made a decision that day that cost him comfort and bought him something much more valuable. My name is Lewis and I am 61 years old. I have worked with my hands my entire adult life. I installed tile, laid concrete, built patios, repaired walls, and for the last 18 years I ran a small but steady construction and renovation business out of a town called Harwick, which sits between two hills in a part of the country where people still wave when you drive past them. I raised one son. His name is Daniel. I raised him mostly alone after his mother, my wife Renata, passed away from a stroke when Daniel was only 13 years old. That was the year the world cracked open for both of us, and I made a decision the night she died that I would not let my son feel lost inside that crack. I would be enough. I would work enough, show up enough, love enough, and sacrifice enough that he would grow up with something solid under his feet even if the ground had shifted. I kept that promise for 20 years. What I did not understand until much later was that keeping a promise to someone does not guarantee they will honor it in return. Daniel grew up sharp. He was the kind of kid who understood systems quickly. He watched me work and absorbed it without ever putting on work boots. He went to college on a partial scholarship that I helped cover with the overtime I had been saving since he was 15. He graduated in 4 years with a degree in business and finance, and within 2 years of graduating, he was already working for a commercial real estate development company that paid him a salary that made my annual income look like a rounding error. I was proud of him. I was genuinely and completely proud of him. There's a kind of pride a working man feels when his child surpasses him that is hard to describe. It is not jealousy. It is not bitterness. It is something closer to relief. I had worried for 20 years that I was not enough, and when Daniel succeeded, part of me felt like I had finally paid off a debt I had been carrying since the night Renata died. The woman Daniel married was named Priscilla. They met at work. She was from a different kind of family than ours, the kind where the parents had a second home and a financial advisor, and an opinion about every decision their children made. Her mother, Claudette, was the sort of woman who could make you feel uninvited at your own table without ever saying a single rude word. She had a way of asking questions that were really judgments dressed in curiosity. When I met her the first time at Daniel and Priscilla's engagement dinner, she asked me what kind of work I did. I told her. She smiled and said, "Oh, so you work with your hands," and then turned to ask Priscilla's father something else entirely. I noticed it. I filed it away. I told myself it did not matter. That was the first mistake. When something tells you how it is going to be, believe it. The engagement was announced, and I was told about it after the ring was already on Priscilla's finger. Daniel called me on a Thursday evening and said I proposed, and she said yes, and I said, "That is wonderful, son," and I meant it. What I did not say was, "I wish I had known you were planning this." What I did not say was, I would have liked to have been part of that moment somehow, even just knowing it was coming. I swallowed those feelings and focused on being happy for him. The wedding planning started immediately and Priscilla's parents took the lead from day one. Claudette had opinions about the venue, the flowers, the menu, the photographer, the seating, and the invitation list. I was consulted about very little. I was told what time to arrive, what I was expected to wear, and that I would be giving a short toast during the reception, no longer than 3 minutes, please, because the schedule was tight. I gave a 3-minute toast. I wrote it by hand at my kitchen table the night before the wedding, sitting alone under the lamp my wife had picked out at a garage sale 12 years before she died. I kept it short and clean and honest. I talked about Daniel as a boy and what his mother would have felt seeing him that day. I saw Daniel's eyes go red at the edges during that part. I saw Priscilla squeeze his hand. But I also saw Claudette check her watch while I was still speaking, and I saw Priscilla's father refill his glass and look toward the back of the room. I finished my toast, sat down, and spent the rest of the reception talking mostly to Daniel's old college roommate who had come alone from out of town. Nobody at the head table came to find me again that night. After the wedding, the visits slowed. In the first year of their marriage, I saw Daniel maybe 4 times. I understood that newlyweds build their own life. I was not expecting weekly dinners and long phone calls. But 4 times in a year felt like a number that had been decided rather than something that just happened naturally. I called Daniel often enough. He answered sometimes and texted back other times with short replies that told me he was fine, busy, things were good. When I asked if I could come visit them in the city where they lived, he would say, "Things are really hectic right now, let's plan something soon." Soon never arrived. I started marking in my head how much time had passed between real conversations. Weeks became months. There was one stretch of 11 weeks where Daniel and I exchanged nothing more than a handful of texts. I counted. I know that sounds sad. Maybe it was. But I needed to know if I was imagining the distance or if the distance was real. The distance was real. What I did not know during those 11 weeks was that Daniel and Priscilla had purchased land. Not in the city where they lived, not nearby, but about 2 hours north, on the edge of a lake called Carver's Landing. The property had a small original cabin on it that was apparently structurally sound but aesthetically dated, and Daniel had hired an architecture firm to design a new primary structure while the old cabin was renovated into a guest cottage. He had also hired a landscaping company to overhaul the grounds, which is how a man named Hector came to be working on that property every week for most of a year. I would not learn Hector's name until later, but Hector would become one of the most important people in this story. I found out about the lake house property by accident. I was having lunch with a man named Gerald, who was a commercial realtor I had done work for over the years. Gerald and I had stayed friendly and occasionally had lunch when I was in his part of town. He mentioned, without any particular weight to it, that he had heard Daniel had picked up a serious parcel up at Carver's Landing. He said it in the way people say things when they assume you already know. I nodded like I did. I drove home and sat in my truck in the driveway for a while. My son had bought land, hired architects, and begun construction on what sounded like a significant property, and he had not mentioned a single word of it to me. Not a word. I did not call Daniel immediately. I thought about it for 3 days. I went back and forth in my head between giving him the benefit of the doubt and allowing myself to feel what I actually felt, which was something close to erasure. I had spent my adult life in construction and renovation. I had built things. I had opinions and knowledge and experience that would have been genuinely useful. And my son had not thought to tell me, not as a contractor, not as a consultant, not even as a father who might simply want to know what his child was building for his future. On the 4th day, I called Daniel. He picked up on the 3rd ring. I told him Gerald had mentioned the lake property. There was a brief silence on the line. Then Daniel said, "Oh yeah, we picked that up about 8 months ago. We've been working on the new structure for a while. It's really coming together, 8 months." The project had been happening for 8 months, and I was learning about it from a lunch companion. I asked Daniel why he had not told me. He said, "I don't know, I figured I'd show you once it was done." I asked when it would be done. He said, "Probably 4 or 5 more months. Maybe this fall." I said, "I would love to see it when it's ready." He said, "Absolutely, we'll have you up. I'll let you know." And then we talked about something else, and the call ended 20 minutes. Later, the way most of our calls ended, pleasantly, without anything being resolved. The fall came and went. I did not receive an invitation to see the lake house. I sent Daniel a text in October asking how the property was coming along. He replied the next day saying, "Almost done, still some finishing work, we'll figure out a visit soon." November passed. December came and I assumed there would be some kind of holiday gathering or at least a conversation about what the holidays looked like this year. There was not. I called Daniel on Christmas morning. He answered from what sounded like a busy house, voices in the background, music playing. He talked to me for about 9 minutes and then said he had to go because Priscilla's family was arriving. I wished him a Merry Christmas. I sat at my kitchen table and ate the meal I had made for myself and watched the afternoon light move across the wall. By February of the following year, I had still not been invited to see the lake house. It had been completed by then based on what Daniel mentioned in passing during a short call in January. He said the finishing work was done and they had spent a weekend there over New Year's and it was beautiful. He said he would send me some photos. He never sent the photos. In February, something in me shifted. I'm not a man who acts impulsively. I think carefully before I move. But I had been patient for a long time, and the patience had produced nothing except more distance. I looked up the address for the Carver's Landing property because Gerald had mentioned the general area, and I was able to find the county records without much difficulty. I knew the property was in my son's name. I knew the basic plot description. And I made a decision that I now understand was both the right call and the one that cracked everything open. I drove up on a Saturday morning in February. It was cold but clear. I did not call ahead. That was intentional. I had called ahead enough times and made enough appointments that were eventually canceled or moved or quietly forgotten. This time I simply drove. 4 hours and 20 minutes from my driveway to the edge of the lake property. When I pulled up the long gravel approach road and the property came into view through the bare winter trees, I understood for the first time just how large this project had been. This was not a cabin renovation. This was a serious piece of architecture, a wide main house with high windows and a cedar exterior sitting on rising ground above the lake. A smaller restored cottage off to the left with smoke coming from a chimney. A rebuilt dock over the water. Landscaped grounds, dormant in winter but clearly designed with intention. It was genuinely stunning. I sat in my truck for a moment and let myself feel proud, not of what I had built, but of Daniel for having built it. And then underneath the pride there was something else. Something that asked why I had to drive 4 hours unannounced just to see it. Something that asked what kind of son builds something this beautiful and does not think to bring his father here. I got out of the truck. I walked toward the main entrance along a stone path that cut through the landscaped beds. And that was when I saw the man. He was working near the perimeter of the garden beds on the east side of the house, pulling up something from between dormant plants, a rake leaning against the stone wall beside him. He was in his 50s, lean, with weathered hands and a direct expression. He saw me come up the path and stood very still for a moment. Then he walked toward me and I could see immediately that his expression was not welcoming. It was the look of a man who recognized a situation he had been expecting. He reached me at the edge of the path and he took hold of my arm, not roughly, but with real intention. He leaned in and said quietly, "You need to leave before he gets back." I looked at him. I said, "I am sorry, who are you?" He said, "I'm Hector. I take care of the grounds here." I said, "I'm Lewis. I'm Daniel's father." And I watched something move across Hector's face that I can only describe as a conflict, like he knew something he had not expected to need to tell me. He let go of my arm. He looked toward the house and then back at me. He said, "I know who you are. I've seen photos of you inside." I said, "Then you know I'm not a stranger." He said, "I know that. But you still need to leave before he comes back because there are things set up here that you don't know about, and if he comes back and finds you here, it's going to go badly for you." I told Hector I was not leaving. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "All right, that's your call to make." And he went back to his work, though I noticed he glanced toward the driveway twice in the next 10 minutes. I walked to the front entrance and knocked on the door of the main house. There was no answer. I tried again, nothing. I walked around to the cottage and knocked there. A woman opened door, not Priscilla, but a woman I did not recognize, middle-aged, wearing a heavy wool cardigan. She looked at me with visible uncertainty and said, "Can I help you?" I said, "I'm Lewis, Daniel's father. I've come to see the property." She said, "Oh," and the way she said that single word told me she knew exactly who I was and had not expected this moment. She stepped back and let me in. Her name was Gloria, and she was Priscilla's aunt, Claudette's younger sister. She had been staying in the cottage for the past month, helping with some decorating and organizing for the main house. She poured me coffee without asking, and we sat at the small kitchen table in the cottage, and for the first 20 minutes the conversation was light and careful. We talked about the drive up, the weather, the property. But I am good at reading rooms, and I could feel something underneath the small talk, something loaded, something that the coffee and the polite questions were sitting on top of. I asked Gloria directly, "What was Hector warning me about?" She set her cup down. She said, "Lewis, I'm going to be honest with you because I think you deserve it even if it makes things uncomfortable." I said, "Please." She said, "Priscilla and Daniel have been talking about formalizing some things with the property, some arrangements, and Claudette has been involved in those conversations. And some of those arrangements, if you arrived unexpectedly, might be harder to undo or change." I looked at her. I said, "What kind of arrangements?" She said, "The kind that have to do with who has access to the property and in what capacity." I said, "I am Daniel's father." She said, "I know that. But there are documents being drawn up that I don't think you know about, and I don't think Daniel has told you what's in them. I spent that night in a motel about 12 miles from the lake property. I did not call Daniel that evening. I needed to think. I lay on the motel bed in the dark and I thought about what Gloria had said and what it meant. Documents, arrangements, access. These were not words about a family lake retreat. These were words about ownership, legal instruments, formal decisions about who was and was not included in something. I had no money in this property. Daniel had built it entirely on his and Priscilla's income, which was considerable. I had no legal claim to it. I was not looking for one. But the fact that documents were being drawn up while I had not been invited to even see the place, while I was still waiting for photos that never arrived, pointed toward something that went beyond rudeness. It pointed toward a plan. In the morning I drove back to the property. Hector was there again, this time working near the dock. He saw my truck come up the road and he stopped work and waited. I parked and walked to him. I said I stayed. He looked at me with something that was almost respect. He said, "I see that." I said, "I need to understand what you meant yesterday." He said, "Look, I shouldn't get in the middle of family business." I said, "You already put yourself in the middle when you grabbed my arm." He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Fair enough." He leaned the rake against the dock post and he told me what he knew. Hector had been working the property for almost a year. He came twice a week in the warm months, once a week in winter. He had become a kind of quiet fixture at the property, the way good groundskeepers do, present but unnoticed by most, which means he heard things. Over the course of that year, he had heard Priscilla and Claudette talk about the property many times. He had heard them discuss who would be given access to the lake house and who would not. He had heard Claudette say on more than one occasion that certain people created the wrong energy for the space and should not be given keys or gate codes or open invitations. He had heard Priscilla refer to those certain people as people who would need to be managed carefully. Hector said he did not know everything, but he knew enough to know that Louis, the father, had been specifically discussed, and not in a welcoming way. I asked Hector if he had ever heard Daniel say anything. He paused. He said, "Daniel is a complicated situation." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "Daniel doesn't push back. He goes along with what makes things smooth at home. I've seen it many times. He's not a bad man, but he chooses what's easy over what's right, and he's been choosing that for a while now." I nodded. That landed somewhere deep and accurate. Daniel was not cruel by nature. Daniel was passive. And there is a particular kind of pain that comes when someone you love is not cruel but simply will not protect you. It can almost hurt worse than cruelty because you cannot be angry at them cleanly. The anger has no clean edge. It blurs with grief and confusion and the memory of every time they were good to you, which makes it harder to carry. I thanked Hector. He said, "For what it's worth, I think you should be here. A man should know his son's home." I said, "I think so too." Then I walked back to my truck and sat there for a while looking at the lake through the bare trees, silver and still in the February morning, and I thought about what kind of man I wanted to be from this point forward. Daniel and Priscilla arrived at the property that afternoon. I was still there. I had parked near the cottage and was talking with Gloria when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel and saw their car come up the road. Through the cottage window, I watched Daniel get out first. He was wearing a dark coat, his hair shorter than the last time I had seen him in person, which had been many months ago. Priscilla got out of the passenger side. She stood by the car and looked toward the main house without seeing me yet. Then Daniel turned and saw my truck and he went very still. I stepped out of the cottage door. Daniel's face moved through several expressions in about 2 seconds. Surprise, recognition, and then something complicated that I could not fully read, but that included, I thought, guilt. He came toward me and we shook hands, and then he pulled me into a brief hug that was warmer than I expected but shorter than it should have been. He said, "Dad, what are you doing here?" Not in an angry way, in the way of someone who was not prepared for this situation and was calculating quickly. I said, "I came to see the lake house you built." He said, "I was going to have you up soon." I said, "You have been going to have me up for about 8 months now." He had no response to that. Priscilla came across the gravel with a controlled smile that I recognized from every family gathering I had ever attended with her. The smile that does not reach the eyes. The smile that is doing a job. She said, "Louis, this is a surprise." I said, "I imagine so." She said, "We would have arranged something if you had called." I said, "I did call. Several times. Over several months." She nodded and said, "Well, you're here now. Come see the house." And she walked toward the front entrance as if she were the host of a formal tour and I were a client who had arrived without an appointment. The house was extraordinary. I will give Daniel and Priscilla that without qualification. What they had built on that lake property was genuine and considered and beautiful in every detail. Exposed structural beams, custom windows that framed the water view, stone fireplace in the main room, a kitchen that was designed by someone who understood both beauty and function. I walked through it and said very little because there was too much to take in and also because I was thinking about 2 things simultaneously. The first was how much I would have loved to have been part of building this, even in an advisory capacity, even as someone who just got to watch it come together. The second was the documents Gloria had mentioned, We ate dinner that evening in the main house kitchen, the four of us, Gloria having accepted an invitation to join. The conversation stayed on the surface. We talked about the construction timeline, the contractors Daniel had used, the furniture Priscilla had sourced. I listened and asked questions and watched the dynamic in the room. Claudette was not there, but her presence was there the way it always was, in the shape of decisions that had already been made, in the way Priscilla moved through the kitchen with full ownership of every space and every object, in the way Daniel deferred to her on every question of preference or taste. I noticed that Daniel poured his own wine twice before remembering to offer me a glass. Small thing, but small things accumulate. After dinner, Gloria excused herself to the cottage. And then it was the three of us, and the surface conversation finally ran out of road. Priscilla said, "Louis, I'm glad you came up. I actually think it's good timing. There are some things we've been meaning to discuss with you." Daniel was looking at his hands. I said, "Then let's discuss them." She said, "Daniel and I have been thinking about the long-term structure of the property. Who has access, how it's used, what the parameters are for family visits." I said, "Parameters." She said, "Yes, just basic things. It's a private property and we want to be thoughtful about how it functions." I said, "I understand that." Priscilla said, "We'd like to be clear that visits should always be arranged in advance." She said it in a tone that was reasonable and firm and completely designed to preempt any challenge. I said, "I drove 4 hours today because my son has never invited me to see his home." She said, "We were going to invite you." I said, "When?" She did not answer. Daniel said, "Dad, we just want to have some structure." I looked at my son. I said, "Daniel, I have been calling you for months. I have been waiting for an invitation you told me was coming. I came here today because I needed to see this place with my own eyes, not because I wanted to be a problem." He said, "You're not a problem." I said, "Then why did your groundskeeper tell me to leave before you got here?" That landed. I saw something shift in Daniel's face. He looked at Priscilla. She kept her expression level, but there was a tightening around her jaw that I had not seen before. She said, "Hector doesn't speak for us." I said, "No, but he knew enough about your plans to think that warning me was the right thing to do." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Priscilla said, "Louis, we have been working with an estate attorney on some documents related to the property. It would be wrong to discuss the details without the full context of those documents." I said, "I have no financial interest in this property. I am not here for that. What I am here for is to understand why my son has been keeping me at a distance for the past 2 years, and whether that distance is by his choice or someone else's." Another silence. Daniel said, "That's not fair." I said, "Which part?" He did not answer. That night I slept in the guest room in the main house. Priscilla had offered it with the practiced hospitality of someone who had calculated that refusing would look worse than offering. I lay awake in that beautiful room listening to the lake sounds through the window, and I thought about the documents. I thought about the estate attorney. I thought about the word parameters. I thought about Hector's face when he warned me to leave, and I made a decision. I was going to find out exactly what was in those documents, not because I wanted money or property, but because if there was something in those documents that was designed to formally limit my presence in my own son's life, I deserved to know it. The next morning I got up early and walked the property while Daniel and Priscilla were still asleep. Hector arrived at his usual time, and we walked the grounds together in the early cold, talking quietly. I asked him if he had ever seen any paperwork at the property, anything left out, anything he had observed. He said, "I don't make a habit of looking at people's papers." Then he paused and said, "But I did once see a folder on the kitchen counter when I came in to fill a water request. It had a law firm name on the tab." I said, "Do you remember the name?" He said, "Whitmore and Associates, Family Estate Law." I had the name by the time the sun was fully up. I did not confront Daniel that morning. I had breakfast with him and Priscilla and kept the conversation light and warm. I complimented the property genuinely and specifically. I asked questions about the neighbors, the town nearby, their plans for the spring. I behaved like a man who had not spent the night thinking about what he was going to do next. Then I drove home. 4 hours back south, I stopped once for gas and coffee, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, I had already done 2 things on my phone during the stop. I had looked up Whitmore and Associates and confirmed they were a real firm operating in estate and family property law in the county where the lake house sat. And I had called a friend of mine named Arthur, who had been a real estate attorney for 30 years before he retired, and I had left him a message asking if we could meet. Arthur called back that evening. I told him the basic situation, not all of it, not yet, but enough. I told him my son had a property, an estate attorney involved, and documents I had not been shown. I told him I had no financial stake but wanted to understand the legal landscape. Arthur said, "Louis, if an estate attorney is drawing up property access documents or family use agreements, You have a right to understand what those documents say if your name or role appears in them in any way. He said, get your son on the phone and ask him directly whether your name is in those documents. He said if he says yes and won't tell you the details, that tells you something. If he says no and you later find out otherwise, that tells you something too. I called Daniel the day after I returned home. I asked him directly, are there any legal or formal documents being prepared that involve my name, my access, or my relationship to the lake property or to your estate? Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, there are some general estate planning documents, but nothing you need to worry about right now. I said, Daniel, that is not an answer to my question. He said, Dad, it's complicated. Priscilla and I are handling our estate planning, and it's not really a family conversation yet. I said, if my name is in those documents, it is already a family conversation. He said, I'll talk to you more about it when things are finalized. I said, I want to talk about it before it is finalized. He said, I'll call you next week. He did not call the next week. This was the moment when the last of my patience ran out. Not loudly, not with a declaration. It ran out the way a tank of gas runs out on a long road, steadily and then suddenly empty. I sat down that Sunday morning and I wrote a letter, not an emi. A physical letter on paper in my own handwriting, 3 pages long. I wrote about Renata. I wrote about the years after she died and what I had carried alone. I wrote about the construction loans I had taken to cover Daniel's tuition gap and paid back over 5 years without saying a word about it. I wrote about the 3 years I had been his emergency contact and had driven 4 hours at 2 in the morning once during his college years when he had a panic attack that sent him to the University Medical Center. I wrote about the business I had scaled so that, when Daniel graduated, there would be money to help him if he needed it. Money I had never offered as leverage and never mentioned as a debt. I wrote all of this not to accuse Daniel of ingratitude, but to ask him one clear question. Does the man who did all of this deserve to be managed and excluded and warned away from his own son's property by a groundskeeper? I mailed the letter to Daniel's home address with a return address clearly marked. I sent a copy to the lake property as well. Daniel called me 6 days after I mailed the letter. He called on a Tuesday evening, and his voice was different from any tone I had recognized in recent years. It was quieter, more careful. He said, I got your letter. I said, I know. He said, there's a lot in there. I said, yes. He said, I didn't know you had taken out loans for my tuition. I said, I know you didn't. You weren't supposed to. I didn't want you carrying that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I feel like there are things I haven't been seeing clearly. I said, I think that's true. He said, I want to explain some things about the documents. I said, I'm listening. He told me that the estate planning had started as a routine process that Claudette had recommended and paid for as a wedding gift to him and Priscilla. The attorney, Whitmore, had been Claudette's attorney for years. The original intent had been to establish a joint estate plan for him and Priscilla that also addressed the lake property as their primary asset. Daniel said that at some point Priscilla and Claudette had introduced language about property access and guest management, and that he had signed off on documents he now admitted he had not fully read. He said that when he had finally reviewed them carefully 2 weeks earlier, which he acknowledged was too late, he had found language that included what he called a preference clause that gave Priscilla primary authority over who could access the lake property with overnight rights, and that the clause specifically referenced paternal family members as subject to Priscilla's approval. I let that settle for a moment. Then I said, Daniel, did you sign a legal document that gives your wife the authority to decide whether your father can stay at your lake property? He said, not in so many words. I said, but in some words. He said, yes. I said, and you did not tell me. He said, I was going to. I said, you were going to tell me after it was finalized, so there was nothing I could do about it. He didn't deny it. I told Daniel I needed time to think. He asked how long. I said, I don't know yet. I'm not a man who delivers ultimatums in heat. I said good night and ended the call. I took 2 weeks. I did not call Daniel. I did not send messages. I thought carefully about what I wanted, what I was willing to accept, and what I was no longer willing to do. I talked to Arthur again, and he explained my options legally, which were limited since I had no financial stake in the property, and the documents were between Daniel and Priscilla with no fraud element I could point to. But Arthur also said something that I wrote down on a piece of paper and kept on my kitchen counter for the rest of those 2 weeks. He said, Lewis, you don't need a legal strategy here. You need a personal one. The question isn't what the law allows. The question is what you're willing to normalize, what I was no longer willing to normalize, being treated as an afterthought by my son, being managed around like a problem that needed careful handling. Having my access to my own son's life determined by his mother-in-law's attorney, staying quiet while the pattern got deeper, being the man who showed up when called and disappeared when not needed and was never truly included in the life he had helped make possible. I called Daniel on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the letter. He picked up on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting. I told him I had thought about everything carefully. I told him I was not going to pursue any legal action because there was nothing to pursue, and that was not my style anyway. I told him I was not going to pretend the documents did not exist or that what I had learned did not matter. I told him that I had been his father for 34 years and had been invisible for the last 2, and I was not going to continue to make myself available for a relationship that operated on the terms of people who did not include me in their consideration. I told him that I loved him with the kind of love that does not expire. But I told him that I was done chasing. I was done calling more than I was called. I was done driving to places I had not been invited to just to prove I still existed. If he wanted a relationship with me, a real one, not a managed one, I was completely and entirely available for that. But I was not going to carry it alone anymore. Daniel was crying by the time I finished. Not sobbing, but his voice had that thick quality that I recognized from when he was a boy and was trying not to show how much something hurt. He said, "Dad, I'm sorry." I said, "I know you are, but sorry is the beginning of something, not the end of it." Over the next 3 weeks, the situation at home between Daniel and Priscilla became something I was only peripherally aware of because Daniel would call me every few days and talk in that careful way of a man who is trying to be honest without betraying the people he lives with. I did not ask him to betray anyone. I listened. I got the sense that the letter had caused a long overdue conversation between them, and that Daniel had raised concerns about the Whitmore documents that Priscilla had not expected him to raise. I also got the sense that Claudette had become involved in those conversations in her familiar way, applying pressure through reason and managing the narrative. Then something happened that shifted the entire situation in a direction none of us had planned. My business partner of 12 years, a man named Frank, approached me in late March with an opportunity. He had a connection who was developing a serious lakefront resort and residential complex in a county that was, by a coincidence that felt almost impossible, within 20 miles of Carver's Landing. The project was substantial, and they needed an experienced construction and renovation lead who understood lakefront property and had a strong record with both commercial and residential builds. Frank thought of me immediately because of my record, and because of a conversation we had once had about the way lakefront properties required a specific set of considerations that most inland contractors underestimated. He said the compensation structure for the lead role was significant, and that there was also an equity stake in the residential component for the right person. I went to the meetings. I brought my portfolio, my references, and 18 years of documented work. The lead developer, a man named Royce, was methodical and thorough. He asked good questions and I gave honest answers. He asked about my experience with high-end custom residential work on challenging terrain. I showed him photos of 7 projects, including a lake house I had built for a private client 8 years earlier that had won a regional design build award. He looked through everything carefully and then looked up at me and said, "Lewis, this is exactly the caliber of work we're looking for." We made an offer before the end of the second meeting. I called Frank from the parking lot and I told him I was in. I did not call Daniel to tell him. I thought about it. I decided to let things develop first. The Carver's Landing project, as the development complex came to be called by those working on it, moved quickly. Royce had strong financing and a tight timeline, and he ran his operation without the delays I had seen on lesser projects. Within 6 weeks, I was up at the site 3 days a week, staying in a rented unit not far from the lake. Carver's Landing was a small community, and a new construction project of this size was notable. People noticed activity. People talked. And within 2 months of the project starting, it came to the attention of people who spent time at the lake. Hector called me one evening in May. He said he thought I should know that Daniel and Priscilla had heard about the Carver's Landing development and that my name had apparently come up in connection with the project. He said the reaction at the lake house had been, in his words, interesting. I thanked him. 2 days later, Daniel called me. His tone was different from the quiet, careful calls of the previous weeks. There was something alive in it, something closer to the son I remembered from before the distance had settled in. Said, "Dad, I heard you're leading the Carver's Landing project." I said, "That's right." He said, "That's a huge project." I said, "It is." He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "You and I have spent a lot of time recently not telling each other things." He laughed. It was a small laugh with some pain in it, but it was real. He asked if they could come see the project site. I said he was welcome any time. He did not mention Priscilla, and I did not ask. He came alone on a Saturday in late May. We walked the site together for 2 hours. I showed him the scope of what was being built, the residential component, the resort structure, the marina access, the environment. All considerations we were navigating. Daniel was quiet in the way he used to be quiet when he was genuinely impressed rather than performing. He asked smart questions. I answered them. At some point, we ended up sitting on the dock frame of the marina section, both of us looking out over the water. He said, "I didn't know you had done work like this." I said, "You never asked." He looked at me. He said, "I know, I'm sorry." I said, "I know you are." He told me that he and Priscilla had been in serious conversations over the past weeks and that he had retained a separate attorney, not Whitmore, to review all of the estate documents. He said there was language in those documents that he had not fully understood when he signed and that he was in the process of having that language amended. He did not give me details and I did not press for them. He said, "I want you to have access to the lake house." Genuine access. Not as a guest subject to approval. As my father. I said, "Daniel, that is what I have always wanted." He said, "I know, I should have made that clear a long time ago." I said, "Yes, you should have." Claudette's response to all of this was predictable in its shape, if not its exact details. She reached out to me directly for the first time in over 2 years. She called my cell phone on a Wednesday afternoon and opened with the kind of warmth she deployed when she wanted something. All first names and concern, and "How are you doing, Louis? It has been too long." I listened politely. She said she had heard about the Carver's Landing project and that it was wonderful and that she had always known I was a talented man. I said thank you. She said that she and Priscilla had been talking about the lake house and about how they would love for me to be more involved in the family going forward. I said, "That would be nice." She said, "We've been thinking it would be wonderful to host a spring gathering at the lake property, all the family together, and of course we would love for you to be there in a meaningful role." I said, "What kind of meaningful role?" She said, "Oh, you know, as Daniel's father, the elder of the family, perhaps you could say a few words, set the tone, give the gathering a sense of occasion." I said, "Like a 3-minute toast at a timed schedule." There was a pause. She said, "Louis, I sense some frustration." I said, "Claudette, I am not frustrated. I am clear. There is a difference." I told Claudette that I appreciated her call and that I would always be willing to attend family events if Daniel invited me directly and personally. I told her that I did not intend to be managed or performed for or included as a symbolic presence to satisfy an optics concern. I told her that I had spent too long being a supporting character in a story I had worked hard to make possible, and that chapter was finished. She said, "I don't think you're being entirely fair." I said, "I think you and I understand fairness differently." I told her I hoped she had a good rest of her week. I ended the call. Priscilla called me the following week. Her approach was different from her mother's. She was more direct and less decorative about it. She said, "Louis, I want to address some things that I think have created misunderstanding between us." I said, "I'm listening." She said, "I want you to know that the estate documents were not intended to exclude you in a harmful way. They were intended to create structure." I said, "Structure that required your approval for my overnight visits to my son's property." She said that language was broader than I intended. I said, "Priscilla, I want to say something to you that I need you to hear clearly. I don't believe you are a bad person. I believe you love my son, and I believe you want a good life for both of you. But I also believe that for the past several years, deliberately or not, you have been part of a structure that kept me at a distance from my son. And I believe that structure benefited someone, and that someone was not Daniel." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I understand why you see it that way." I said, "I'm glad." I also said, "I'd like to have a real relationship with you and with Daniel. I'd like to come to the lake house as a father comes to his son's home. I'd like to not need to be warned away by the groundskeeper." She said that was not something I asked Hector to do. I said, "I know. He did it because he thought I needed to know what I was walking into." And he was right. The spring gathering at the lake house happened in late June. Daniel invited me directly and personally, called me 3 weeks in advance, told me the date and the details, asked if I needed directions even though I had already driven there twice. I arrived the morning before the event and helped him set up tables on the grounds near the water. We worked together for the better part of a morning, moving things around, hanging lights along the dock posts, setting out chairs. We did not talk about the documents or Claudette or Priscilla's aunt or the letter I had written. We talked about the project at Carver's Landing and about a renovation of his property's outdoor kitchen that Daniel wanted to tackle in the fall and whether I would be willing to consult on it. I said I would. He said he wanted to pay me properly for my time. I said, "Let's cross that bridge when we come to it." Claudette arrived with Priscilla's father mid-morning, and she found me already on the grounds with a coffee and a comfortable knowledge of the space. Her expression when she first saw me was a small masterpiece of controlled adjustment. She recovered quickly and said good morning, Lewis, very pleasantly, and I said good morning back, and that was the extent of the tension. She knew things had shifted. She was smart enough to know exactly how and why. She did not attempt the warmth of the phone call. She operated at a polite distance for the rest of the gathering, and I operated at the same distance back, which felt appropriate and clean. Hector was at the property that day doing some planting in the newly prepared beds near the main entrance. At some point in the afternoon when the party was busy and loud around us, I walked over to him. He looked up from the bed he was working and looked at me with that direct expression I had come to appreciate. I said, "You told me to leave." He said, "I know." I said, "I'm glad I didn't." He looked at the gathering on the lawn, at Daniel laughing near the dock with a group of people, at Priscilla moving through the crowd with a glass in her hand, at the lake shining beyond all of it. He said, "Yeah, I think you made the right call." I said, "I think I did too. There is a thing that happens when you stop chasing approval. It is not immediate and it is not loud. It does not arrive with a declaration or a dramatic moment. It arrives the way a door opens when you stop pushing and simply wait, quietly and then completely. I stopped chasing Daniel. I stopped calling more than he called. I stopped scheduling myself around his availability. I stopped apologizing for taking up space in my own son's life. And what happened when I stopped was not that he disappeared. What happened was that he came toward me. Because the thing that approval chasing does is it teaches the other person that you will come to them regardless of whether they meet you halfway. And when you stop, they have to make a decision. Daniel made the right decision. It took him longer than it should have. But he made it. Royce offered me a second project connected to the Carver's Landing development in August of that year. A residential expansion on the north end of the lake that would add 12 high-end units to the complex with an adjusted equity share for me given my work on the primary project. I accepted. I had Frank look it over first and Arthur review the terms, and it was clean and fair. By the end of that summer, I was operating at a level of professional and financial stability I had not expected to reach at 61. The kind of stability that comes not from a windfall, but from 18 years of solid work finally being recognized by people with the resources to honor it. I did not tell Claudette about the second project. I did not tell Priscilla. I told Daniel over the phone one afternoon in late August, and he said, "Dad, that is incredible." I said, "It's been a good year." He said, "When can I come see the site?" I said, "Anytime." He said, "I'll be there next weekend." He was. At some point in the fall, Daniel and I were sitting on the dock at the lake house after an afternoon of working on the outdoor kitchen project together. It was October, and the light was doing that thing it does over still water in October, going gold and flat at the same time, spreading wide. Neither of us said much for a while. Then Daniel said, "I want to tell you something." I said, "All right." He said, "When I built this place, I think I was trying to build something that made me feel like I had made it, like I had gotten somewhere that proved I was capable of being more than the kid whose mom died and whose dad worked himself to the bone." I said, "I understand that." He said, "But I think in trying to make it feel like something I had done myself, I ended up cutting out the person who had the most to do with me getting there." I did not say anything. He said that was wrong. I said, "Yes." He said, "I know you won't hold it against me forever." I said, "I don't hold things, but I do remember them." He nodded. He understood the difference. The Whitmore documents were amended in September. Daniel sent me a copy of the revised estate documents with a note that said, "These no longer include language limiting your access to the property." I read through the relevant sections. He was right. The preference clause was gone. My name appeared once in the documents, in the list of family members who held standing open access to the property at any time. I set the document on my kitchen counter next to the piece of paper were. I had written down what Arthur told me. The question isn't what the law allows, the question is what you're willing to normalize. I was no longer willing to normalize being a guest in my son's life. I was also, finally, no longer required to be. The last thing I want to say about all of this is something I thought about on the drive back from Carver's Landing one evening in November when the project was moving into its winter phase, and the lake was gray and cold, and I was tired in the good way that comes from long, useful work. I thought about Hector grabbing my arm on that cold February morning and telling me to leave before he gets back. I thought about what would have happened if I had listened. I would have driven away. I would have gone home feeling dismissed and confused. I would have called Daniel eventually and had a shallow conversation. The documents would have been finalized as they were. My access would have been formally subject to Priscilla's approval. The pattern would have continued another year, another 2 years, until the distance became so normal that neither of us knew how to cross it anymore. But I stayed, not out of stubbornness, not out of anger. I stayed because I had earned the right to be there, not legally. Not financially. I had earned it the way a person earns the right to take up space in the life they have contributed to, with years of work and sacrifice and love that asked for nothing specific in return but did deserve something. It deserved basic acknowledgement. It deserved a seat that did not need to be fought for. It deserved a son who remembered that the house he was standing in had a foundation that went back further than the blueprint. I have that now. It is quieter than I imagined. It does not look like a dramatic reconciliation. It looks like a phone call on a Tuesday for no particular reason. It looks like Daniel asking for my opinion on a material choice for the outdoor kitchen. It looks like Priscilla saying hello Lewis at the door with a warmth that is still careful but is at least real. It looks like Hector nodding at me across the garden when I arrive for a visit, as if to say, you made the right call. It looks like a seat at the table that no one has to check the documents to confirm. That is enough. It is more than enough. It is, in fact, everything. Lewis stayed when every signal told him to go, and everything that followed came from that one decision to stop making himself smaller in order to keep the peace. If you have ever been the person in your family who gave the most and was seen the least, the one who showed up quietly while others were loudly included, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me whether you stayed or whether you walked away, and whether either decision brought you what you needed. Lewis's story is not finished. It never is for people like him. But this chapter ended the way it needed to. Not with noise, not with revenge that looked like revenge, but with a door that finally stayed open.